Welcome to the game of chess. Did you know chess is the most popular board game in the world? A recent study found that worldwide, more than 600 million people play chess regularly. In this course I will teach you how to play chess, I will show you how the pieces move, and I'll explain what you need to do if you want to win the game. But before I continue, maybe you are wondering how chess started. Well, nobody actually knows, but there is an old legend that chess was played more than 1,500 years ago, when an Indian king asked his soldiers to invent a game that represented a war. The king's idea was that by playing this game, his soldiers wouldn't only be strong, but they would become smart too. The game that the king's advisors invented would be played between two people, and the person you played against would be your opponent. Each player received 16 chess men, which would be referred to as the pieces. The first team would be named white, and the other team black. The purpose of the game was to capture as many as possible of your opponent's pieces, and then to eventually trap their king. As soon as you managed to trap your opponent's king, it would be called checkmate, and you would be the winner. But of course it's not easy to trap your opponent's king, because they won't simply allow you to do so. In a moment I will show you how the chess pieces are allowed to move, but first there are a few important things that you need to know about the chessboard. There are 64 squares on a chessboard, and a row of squares on a vertical line is called a file. So this would be the A file. Next to it the B file, C, D, E, F, G and H file lastly. On the other hand, a row of squares on a horizontal line is called a rank. So this would be called the first rank, and the second rank, third, fourth, fifth, sixth, seventh, and then lastly we have the eighth rank. Then we also get diagonals. Some diagonals are long and others are short. The important thing to know about a diagonal is that all the squares on the diagonal are the same color. You've probably already noticed that some of the squares on the board are light and others are dark. The reason for this is to help you see the diagonals clearly. Chess players usually refer to a diagonal as a light square diagonal or a dark square diagonal. You can see all the squares on this diagonal are light, and so it would be called a light square diagonal. All the squares on this diagonal are dark, and so it would be called a dark square diagonal. To summarize, the squares on a vertical row are known as a file. The squares on a horizontal row are known as a rank. And all the squares of a diagonal are the same color. Then you should also know that the four squares in the middle of the board are known as the center. So if I ever refer to the center, then you know I'm talking about these four squares in the middle of the board. Each of the 64 squares on the chessboard have their own name. If you want to know the name of the square, then you simply check the letters and the numbers on the side of the board. For example, the name of this square is E4 because it's on the E file and on rank number 4. And the name of this square would be G7 because it's on the G file and on rank number 7. You always say the letter first and then the number. You say G7, not 7G. Now it's time to learn about the pieces. And first of all, I'll introduce you to their names, and at the same time I will also show you how to pack a chessboard at the start of the game. We start with this piece. This is the rook. Sometimes it's also referred to as the castle, but its correct name is the rook. You will notice that each side starts the game with two rooks, one in the left hand corner and one in the right hand corner. It's the same for black. One rook in each corner. Then next to each of the rooks you place a knight, one on the left hand side and one on the right hand side, and of course it's the same for black. Next to the knights you place the bishops, also one on the left hand side and one on the right hand side, and the same for black. On the two remaining squares you place the king and the queen. But notice that when you pack the pieces, you should always place the queen on a matching square. In other words, the white queen would start the game on a light square, and the black queen would start the game on a dark square. Notice that the white pawns will be packed on the second rank, and the black pawns would be packed on the 7th rank. This is not just coincidence, this is how it should be. You should always pack the white pieces on row 1 and 2 and the black pieces on row 7 and 8. One more thing I need to say about the chessboard is that this side of the chessboard is referred to as the king side because it's the side of the board where the kings start the game. And this side is the queen side because it's the side where the queens start. So if you hear a chess player refer to the king side, then you know they are talking about this side of the board. And if they mention the queen side, then they are referring to this side of the board. You know now the names of all the pieces, and you know how to pack the board. The player with the white pieces always makes the first move, and after that the two players take turns to make a move. You must make a move when it's your turn. In other words, you are not allowed to skip your turn. Now we get to the most important part of this lesson, learning how the chess pieces move. We'll start with the rook. And to show you how the rook moves, I'll remove the other pieces from the board, except the kings. Because during a game you may never remove the kings from the board. The rook can move over long distances in a straight line, up or down, or left or right, as far as he wants to. If this rook wants to be on the d8 square, he can do that in one move. However, if he wants to be on h8, that would require two moves. For example, on his first move he can move to d8, and then on the next move he can go to h8. Or he could move to h4 on the first move, and then on the next move he can go to h8. But here's an important rule. Chess pieces may not jump over other pieces. For example, if there is a bishop on this square, then white's rook may not move to h4 anymore, because he's not allowed to jump over the bishop. He also can't move to this square either, because there may only be one piece on a square. However, if an enemy piece occupies a square where you can move, for example, if this was a black bishop, then you may capture that piece. You are still not allowed to jump over it. In other words, the rook is still not allowed to go to h4, but you may capture this piece. And you do so by moving your piece to this square, and you remove your opponent's piece from the board. In chess we say you capture the black bishop. Next we look at the bishop. The bishop can also move over long distances, but only on diagonals. If the bishop wants to be on g7, he can do that in one move. But if he wants to be on f8, that would require two turns. He could go to g7 first, for example, and then on the next move he can go to f8. Or he could go to c5, and then to f8 on the next move. Again, you may not jump over other pieces, but if an enemy piece occupies a square where your bishop can move, then you may capture it. Next we look at the queen. The queen is the most powerful piece in your army because she can move like a rook, that is up and down and left or right, but she can also go like a bishop on the diagonals. If this queen wants to be on h8, she can do that in one move. However, if she wants to be on f7, that would require two turns. But because she can move on straight lines as well as on diagonals, there are many ways to get to f7 within two moves. She could go to d5 and then to f7 on the next move. Or she can go to a7 and then to f7. Or she can even go to f2 first and then on the next move to f7. I'm sure you can see why the queen is such a powerful piece. However, as is the case with the other pieces, she is not allowed to jump over any other piece. But again, if an enemy piece occupies a square where your queen can move, then she can capture that piece and remove it from the board. Next, the king. Even though the king is the most important piece, he is not the strongest, because he may move in any direction but only one square at a time. Up or down, left or right, or on a diagonal, any direction but only one square at a time. So if this king wants to be on h7, he will need 4 turns to do so. For example, 1, 2, 3, 4. Or he could go this way, 1, 2, 3, and 4. And if an enemy piece is on a square where he can move, then he can capture that piece. Let's take a look at the knight. The knight move is harder to learn than the other pieces, because the knight is the only piece that does not move in a straight line, and it's also the only piece that may jump over his own or even over enemy pieces. The knight always jumps around a corner. An easy way to remember this movement is to think that the movement looks like a capital letter L. He can make this move in any direction. For example, he can jump here, or here, or here, or here. So you can make this L-shaped jump in any direction, or here, or here, or here. He may also jump over other pieces. Here's an example. So even if a piece is in the way, he may jump over it. But notice that if he jumps over an enemy piece, then he doesn't capture that piece. He can only capture an enemy piece that's on the square where he wants to land. So in this example, he jumps over the black pawn, but he doesn't capture it. He does, however, capture the black rook, since it's on the square where he lands. It would be a good idea to pause the video here for a moment and think about the moves of the knight. It will help you remember the move. Remember, the knight moves in an L shape and is the only piece that's allowed to jump over his own or over enemy pieces. Lastly, we look at how the pawn moves. A pawn can move only forward and only one square at a time. A pawn cannot go backward, only forward. However, any pawn that still stands on its starting square, in other words a pawn that hasn't moved yet, may choose to move 1 or 2 squares. This pawn may still move 2 squares if he wants. This one already moved from its starting square, so he may move only 1 square. A pawn is also different to all the other pieces because he cannot capture an enemy piece that occupies a square right in front of him. If an enemy piece is on a square in front of your pawn, then this pawn cannot move forward, it's blocked. But the pawn can also capture an enemy piece just in a unique way. He can capture diagonally 1 square far. So even though this pawn is currently blocked, if black placed a piece on this square or on this square, then the pawn would be able to capture it. However, notice that the pawn can't move in that way unless he is capturing something. So if the black rook moved here, then the white pawn would be able to capture it. Now here's one more thing you need to know about a pawn. If a pawn reaches the last rank on the other side of the board, then it becomes one of the large pieces, and he may choose what he wants to be. It can become a knight, or a bishop, or a rook, or a queen, but it can't become a king, and it also can't stay a pawn. It must become one of the big pieces. It works like this. The pawn moves onto the last rank, and then you remove it from the board and place the piece of your choice on the square where the pawn promoted. In most cases, the pawn will choose to become a queen, because the queen is the most powerful piece. And even if you still have your queen from the start of the game, you may get another queen, because every time one of your pawns reaches the other side of the board, then that pawn can become a queen. In chess, this special move is known as promotion. Now that you've almost reached the end of this lesson, let's quickly review some of the important things you've learned. The rook moves as far as he wants in a straight line, up, down, left or right. And if an enemy piece occupies a square where he can move, then he can capture that piece. The bishop moves on the diagonals, also as far as he wants. And if an enemy piece occupies a square where he can move, then he can capture that piece. The queen can move like a rook, that's up and down and left or right, or as we say, on the ranks and on the files. And she can also move like a bishop on the diagonals. That's why the queen is your most powerful piece. The king may move in any direction, but only 1 square at a time. So he can go up or down, or left or right, or on the diagonals, but only 1 square at a time. The knight always jumps around a corner, and he may jump over his own and also over enemy pieces. But he cannot capture a piece if he jumps over it. He can only capture a piece on the square where he lands. A pawn can only move straight ahead, and only 1 square at a time. But if he is still on his starting square, then he may move 1 or 2 squares. But thereafter, only 1 square at a time. A pawn can't capture straight. If an enemy piece is on the square right in front of the pawn, then that pawn is blocked. A pawn captures on a diagonal, 1 square far. And if a pawn should reach the last rank on the other side of the board, then he gets a promotion and he can choose to become a knight, bishop, rook or queen. I hope you enjoyed this lesson and learned a lot from it. In the next lesson you will learn what an exchange is and why it's so important in chess, and I will also show you how to make good exchanges in chess. I'll see you there.